Okay, let's settle in. Find a comfortable spot, let your body relax, and allow your mind to drift back through the mists of time. Tonight, we journey to an era of emperors and empires, of marble cities and whispered intrigues, to uncover the story of a boy who became a god, and then a cautionary tale. This isn't a story to stir you, but one to ponder as you drift towards sleep, a glimpse into a world so different, yet filled with human dramas that echo even now. Breathe deeply and let the story begin. Our story begins not in the bustling heart of Rome, but far to the east, in the sun-drenched Syrian city of Emesa. Imagine a place vibrant with ancient traditions, where the air hummed with a different kind of energy than that of the Roman Forum. Here, in the early 3rd century AD, lived a young boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus, though history would come to know him by a name far more exotic and controversial, Elagabalus. He wasn't just any boy. His family was one of immense wealth and influence, deeply connected to the local religious life. His maternal grandmother, Julia Maesa, was a woman of formidable intellect and ambition, sister to the Empress Julia Domna, wife of the mighty Emperor Septimius Severus. This lineage placed young Avitus, even as a child, within the glittering, often dangerous, orbit of imperial power. From his earliest years, Avitus was groomed for a special role. He was the hereditary high priest of the local sun god, Elagabal. Picture him, a child, perhaps no older than 10 or 11, robed in splendid, exotic garments, officiating at ceremonies in a temple filled with the scent of incense and the sound of ancient chants. The god Elagabal was represented not by a human-like statue, as was common in Rome, but by a sacred black conical stone, believed to have fallen from the heavens. For the people of Emesa, and for young Avitus, this stone was the embodiment of divine power, a direct link to the celestial. Life in Emesa would have been a stark contrast to the upbringing of a Roman aristocrat. While Roman youth studied rhetoric, law, and military strategy, Avitus was immersed in the mystical rites of an Eastern deity. He danced in religious processions, learned the sacred songs, and felt the weight of a spiritual tradition that was ancient even then. This upbringing would profoundly shape the man and the emperor he was to become. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire, vast and sprawling, was experiencing its own dramas. The Syrian dynasty, to which Avitus was related, held the imperial throne, but power in Rome was a fickle thing. Emperors rose and fell, often through violence and intrigue. His cousin, the infamous Emperor Caracalla, was known for his cruelty and military focus. After Caracalla's assassination, a man named Macrinus, a Praetorian prefect, seized power, the first emperor who was not of senatorial rank. This was an affront to many, not least to Julia Maesa. Exiled from the imperial court by Macrinus and forced to return to Emesa with her considerable wealth, she was not a woman to accept defeat. She saw in her grandson, the charismatic young priest of Elagabal, an opportunity. Avitus was young, handsome, and, crucially, he bore a resemblance to Caracalla. Maesa began to cultivate a rumor, a powerful whisper that spread like wildfire among the disaffected legions stationed in the east, that Avitus was not merely Caracalla's cousin, but his illegitimate son. The soldiers, many of whom had been loyal to Caracalla and were unhappy under Macrinus, were receptive. They saw in the boy a link to the Syrian dynasty they revered, and perhaps a touch of the divine glamour that surrounded him as a priest. Julia Maesa used her vast fortune to bribe the legions, promising them riches and a return to Syrian glory. One can only imagine the scene. The formidable Julia Maesa, a woman of iron will, perhaps taking her young grandson aside. He would have been around 13 or 14, on the cusp of manhood, yet still a boy. Avitus, she might have said, her voice firm but her eyes alight with ambition. "The soldiers call for you. They see in you the blood of Severus, the spirit of Caracalla. Rome needs a true emperor, a divine leader. The god Elagabal has chosen you for a destiny far greater than Maesa." Did he understand the full weight of her words? The danger? The sheer audacity of challenging a reigning Roman emperor? Perhaps not entirely. But he was a boy accustomed to being the center of religious devotion, a boy who believed in the power of his god. And so, in the spring of 218 AD, the legions of Syria declared the 14-year-old priest, Varius Avitus Bassianus, as the rightful emperor of Rome. Macrinus, the reigning emperor, was alarmed. He dispatched forces to quell the rebellion, but Maesa's planning and the loyalty of the troops to the supposed son of Caracalla proved too strong. Near Antioch, the forces clashed. It is said that when Avitus's troops began to falter, Julia Maesa and his mother, Julia Soaemius, rode into the heart of the battle, shaming the soldiers into fighting with renewed vigor. The young priest-emperor himself, perhaps holding aloft a symbol of his god, inspired his men. Macrinus was defeated and later captured and executed. The path to Rome was open. The boy from Emesa, the high priest of the Black Stone, was now, by right of conquest and acclamation, the master of the Roman world. He adopted the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, linking himself to revered past emperors, but it was the name of his god, Elagabalus, that would stick, a name that would become synonymous with one of the most bizarre and controversial reigns in Roman history. As he prepared to journey to the heart of the empire, one wonders what thoughts filled his young mind. Excitement? Fear? A divine certainty? Or perhaps a dawning realization that the world he knew was about to be replaced by something far larger, more complex, and infinitely more perilous. The sun god of Emesa was going to Rome, and Rome would never be quite the same. The journey from Syria to Rome was not a swift one. It took over a year for Elagabalus and his entourage, which included his mother Julia Soaemius, his grandmother Julia Maesa, and the sacred black stone of his god, to reach the imperial capital. News of the new emperor, a mere boy, a priest of an outlandish Eastern cult, preceded him, carried by merchants, soldiers, and officials. Rome, a city that had seen its share of eccentric rulers, waited with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and, among the traditional elite, deep suspicion. Imagine the scene as his procession finally approached the city in 219 AD. This was no traditional Roman triumph. Elagabalus, now around 15 years old, reportedly entered the city not in the austere toga of a Roman statesman, but in the vibrant, flowing silk robes of an Eastern priest, adorned with jewels and amulets. His appearance itself was a shock to the Roman sensibilities. He was described as handsome, with dark, intense eyes, but his painted eyelids and rouged cheeks, common in Eastern priestly traditions, were seen as effeminate and decadent by the Romans. Even more startling was the prominence given to his god. He had a portrait of himself in his priestly regalia, making offerings to Elagabal, sent ahead to be hung in the Senate House, placed directly above the statue of Victoria, the goddess of victory. This was a clear statement. His god, this foreign deity, was to take precedence. The Senate, that ancient institution of Roman power, had little choice but to formally recognize him. Julia Maesa, the architect of his rise, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, smoothing ruffled feathers, distributing largesse, and ensuring that key positions were filled with loyalists. She and Julia Soaemias were even granted the unprecedented honor of being allowed to attend Senate meetings, a move that, while showcasing their influence, further scandalized traditionalists. Elagabalus himself seemed less interested in the traditional duties of an emperor, the legal administration, the the military strategy, the careful cultivation of senatorial support, than he was in his religious mission. His primary goal, it quickly became apparent, was to establish the worship of Elagabal as the supreme religion of the Roman Empire. He began the construction of a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, the most sacred part of Rome, to house the Black Stone. This temple, the Elagabalium, was to be the center of his new religious order. He declared that Elagabal was, in essence, the Roman Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, but superior to all other gods, including Jupiter, the traditional king of the Roman pantheon. The gods of Rome are but servants to the one true sun god, he might have proclaimed, his youthful voice ringing with a conviction that brooked no argument. To the Romans, who revered their ancestral deities and the complex tapestry of their religious traditions, this was blasphemy. He attempted to unify all religious worship under Elagabal. Sacred relics from other temples across Rome, the eternal flame of Vesta, the Palladium, the shields of Mars, were ordered to be moved to the Elagabalium. His intention, as he saw it, was to create a divine harmony with all gods subservient to his own. To the Romans, it was sacrilege, a dismantling of their most cherished beliefs. The rituals themselves were alien and disturbing to the Roman elite. Elagabalus would dance ecstatically around the altar of his god, dressed in his priestly finery, accompanied by the clashing of cymbals and the beating of drums. There were whispers of secret rites, of sacrifices that went against Roman custom, though many of these tales were likely exaggerated by his detractors. One particularly scandalous act was his marriage to Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. The Vestals were priestesses sworn to chastity for 30 years. To break this vow was a capital offense, believed to bring ruin upon Rome. Elagabalus, however, declared that his marriage to a Vestal was fitting, as it was a union of a priest and priestess, and that godlike children would be born from it. This act horrified the populace and the Senate alike. He would divorce her, marry others, and then remarry her, adding to the sense of instability and disregard for Roman tradition. While his religious fervor was genuine, his understanding of Roman politics and social norms was severely lacking. He was a boy raised in a different world, suddenly thrust into the most powerful position on earth, surrounded by sycophants and family members who, while ambitious for him, perhaps did not fully grasp the depth of Roman conservatism. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, a shrewd political operator, likely watched his excesses with growing concern. She had engineered his rise to restore the Severan dynasty and secure her family's power, not to instigate a religious revolution that threatened to alienate everyone. "Grandson," one can imagine her advising, her tone laced with worry, "Rome is not a mesa. The people revere their ancient gods. You must be an emperor to all Romans, not just a priest to Elagabal. Temper your zeal, or you will lose everything I have fought to gain for you." But Elagabalus, young, headstrong, and convinced of his divine mandate, seemed incapable of moderation. He surrounded himself with companions from his eastern entourage and elevated individuals of low birth, even slaves and freedmen, to high positions, sometimes, it was rumored, based on scandalous or frivolous criteria, such as their dancing ability or, as the video suggested, even more inappropriate measures. The claim about appointments based on the size of genitals, while likely a lurid exaggeration from hostile sources like the Historia Augusta, reflects the perception that his choices were arbitrary and offensive to the established order. The traditional Roman aristocracy, the senators and equestrians who formed the backbone of the administration, felt increasingly marginalized and insulted. They saw their traditions trampled, their gods denigrated, and their authority undermined by a boy emperor who seemed more interested in exotic rituals and personal whims than in the governance of a vast empire. The common people of Rome, too, were bewildered. While often entertained by imperial spectacles, the sheer foreignness of Elagabalus's cult and his disregard for their beloved traditions bred resentment. The city, which had initially watched with curiosity, now buzzed with discontent. The sun that had risen from the east was proving to be too scorching, too alien for the Roman world. The stage was being set for a dramatic and tragic downfall. As Elagabalus settled into his role, or rather, as he attempted to reshape the role of emperor to fit his own unique vision, Rome became a stage for displays of extravagance and behavior that left even the most jaded citizens aghast. It's here that the historical accounts, particularly those written by his enemies, become a whirlwind of scandalous accusations. While we must approach these tales with caution, understanding they might be colored by political bias and a desire to demonize him, they paint a picture of a young ruler utterly detached from Roman expectations and, perhaps, from reality itself. The video you saw touched upon some of the most notorious claims. The idea that he appointed officials based on the size of their genitals is one of the more shocking and frequently cited examples from the Historia Augusta, a late Roman collection of imperial biographies known for its unreliability and penchant for salacious detail. Whether true in its literal sense or not, it symbolized the perception that his appointments were based on caprice and personal favor, often of a debauched nature, rather than merit or experience. He was said to have promoted his barber, a dancer, and a charioteer to positions of great authority, infuriating the senatorial class who saw these roles as their birthright. His personal life became a subject of intense gossip and condemnation. Beyond his controversial marriage to the Vestal Virgin Aquilia Severa, he married and divorced several other women in rapid succession. But it was his relationships with men that drew particular ire. Roman society had a complex attitude towards same-sex relationships. While not uncommon, there were strict expectations about dominant and submissive roles. Elagabalus was accused of openly flouting these conventions. He was said to have a favored charioteer named Hierocles, whom he referred to as his husband and allegedly wished to see declared Caesar. Another figure, Zodicus, an athlete from Smyrna, was brought to the palace and given immense influence, only to be later dismissed. The Historia Augusta and Cassius Dio, a contemporary senator whose accounts are generally more credible though still hostile, detail Elagabalus's supposed desire to be addressed as lady rather than lord, his use of cosmetics, wigs, and women's clothing, and even his alleged attempts to find a physician who could perform a form of gender reassignment surgery. The video mentioned him prostituting himself in taverns and brothels, and even setting up a brothel within the imperial palace. Cassius Dio writes that Elagabalus would stand naked at the door of a room in the palace, soliciting passers-by in the manner of a prostitute, boasting of the number of clients he had and the money he earned. These stories, if true, would have been profoundly shocking to Roman sensibilities, which prized masculine dignity and decorum in their leaders. For an emperor to so publicly debase himself was unthinkable. His banquets were legendary for their bizarre extravagance. It wasn't just the richness of the food, phoenixes, likely a rare bird passed off as such, parrot tongues, and peacock brains, but the strange themes and cruel jokes. He might serve his guests imitation food made of glass or wood, or unleash harmless snakes among them to watch their panic. The video's claim of poisonous snakes at gladiator games is a more extreme version, possibly an embellishment of this theme of causing alarm for amusement. One famous story tells of him inviting 8 bald men, or 8 men with one eye, or 8 exceptionally fat men to a dinner party, seemingly for his own perverse amusement. Another recounts how he once smothered guests in a shower of so many rose petals released from a reversible ceiling that some reportedly suffocated, a tale that, while dramatic, is likely a later invention meant to illustrate his deadly decadence. The video also mentioned him chaining women to chariots like horses and whipping them. This specific claim is found in the Historia Augusta, a source that delights in such lurid details. While it's hard to verify, it fits the pattern of accusations of cruelty and a desire to invert and mock established norms. He was also said to have enjoyed public spectacles where he would distribute largesse, gold and silver coins, food, even animals, by throwing them from a tower into crowds, delighting in the ensuing scramble and chaos as common folk fought over the riches. This was not the dignified generosity expected of an emperor, but a spectacle designed to amuse him through the debasement of others. It's crucial to remember the context. Elagabalus was a teenager, perhaps between 15 and 18 during these years. He had been plucked from a provincial priesthood and given absolute power. He was surrounded by family members who, while initially supportive, were also using him for their own ambitions. He had no real grounding in Roman tradition or governance. It's possible that some of his actions were a naive, albeit extreme, attempt to live up to a divine status, or simply the unchecked whims of a young man intoxicated by limitless power and wealth, egged on by sycophants. The Roman elite, however, saw not a misguided youth, but a monstrous tyrant, a foreign desecrator of all they held sacred. The whispers in the Senate grew louder. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, became increasingly restless. They had acclaimed him as the son of Caracalla, expecting a return to military discipline and Roman values. Instead, they found themselves serving a priest-king who seemed determined to turn Rome into an Eastern temple and its emperor into a figure of ridicule and revulsion. Julia Maesa, the pragmatic grandmother, must have been in despair. Her carefully constructed plan to restore sovereign power was crumbling under the weight of her grandson's excesses. She had wanted a puppet, she had gotten a whirlwind, and she knew, with the cold calculation that had brought her family to power, that a whirlwind that could not be controlled would eventually have to be stopped. The sun god's earthly reign was casting ever darker shadows, and the patience of Rome was wearing perilously thin. Julia Maesa was a woman who understood power, how to gain it, how to wield it, and most importantly, how to preserve it for her family. As she watched her grandson Elagabalus alienate every segment of Roman society, from the stern-faced senators to the grumbling legionaries, she knew that his reign was unsustainable. The Syrian dynasty, which she had fought so hard to restore, was now threatened by the very emperor she had placed on the throne. A change was needed, and Maesa, ever the pragmatist, began to lay the groundwork for it. She had another grandson, a cousin of Elagabalus named Alexianus Bassianus, later known as Severus Alexander. He was younger than Elagabalus, around 12 or 13 at this time, and by all accounts, a far more conventional and promising youth. He was being raised in the Roman tradition, tutored by respected scholars, and displayed a temperament that was mild, studious, and respectful of Roman customs. Everything Elagabalus was not. Maesa began to subtly promote Alexander. She persuaded Elagabalus, perhaps by appealing to his vanity or his supposed affection for his family, to formally adopt Alexander as his son and heir in 221 AD. Elagabalus, possibly seeing no threat from his younger cousin, or perhaps cajoled by his mother Julia Maesa, who was Maesa's daughter and Alexander's aunt, agreed. Alexander was given the title of Caesar, marking him as the successor. This was a masterstroke by Maesa. It provided an alternative focus for the loyalty of those disillusioned with Elagabalus. The soldiers, in particular, began to look favorably upon the young, Romanized Alexander, seeing in him a hope for a return to stability and tradition. Elagabalus, however, was not entirely oblivious. He began to sense a shift in affection. particularly from the Praetorian Guard towards his cousin. Jealousy, or perhaps a dawning realization of the threat Alexander posed, started to take root. He reportedly regretted the adoption and made attempts to undermine Alexander's growing popularity. Stories circulated that Elagabalus tried to have Alexander assassinated, or at least to strip him of his titles and honors. One can imagine the tense atmosphere within the imperial palace. Two young emperors, one flamboyant and increasingly erratic, the other quiet and gaining favor, both manipulated by the powerful women of their family. A scene might have unfolded in the shadowed corridors. Elagabalus, perhaps adorned in his silks and jewels, confronts his grandmother. "Why do the soldiers cheer for him and not for me, their divine emperor?" he might have demanded, his voice petulant. "He is but a boy. I am the chosen of Elagabal." Julia Maesa, her face a mask of calm but her mind racing, would have tried to placate him. "They honor you through him, my emperor. He is your heir, a testament to your generosity and foresight. His popularity reflects well upon you." But Elagabalus was not easily fooled, or perhaps his paranoia was growing. He allegedly forbade Alexander from appearing in public and spread rumors that his cousin was gravely ill, hoping to diminish his standing. When these tactics failed, and the Praetorians demanded to see Alexander to confirm his well-being, Elagabalus was forced to present him. The soldiers' enthusiastic reception of Alexander, contrasted with their sullen silence towards Elagabalus, was a clear sign of where their loyalties now lay. This public display of preference for Alexander seems to have been the final straw for Elagabalus. According to some accounts, he ordered the arrest and execution of those Praetorians who had most vocally supported his cousin. This was a fatal miscalculation. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who had the power to make and unmake emperors, were now openly hostile. The final days of Elagabalus's reign, in early March 222 AD, were filled with chaos and fear. He knew his support was collapsing. He reportedly made desperate attempts to cling to power, even offering to share the emperorship with Alexander, but it was too late. Julia Maesa, having carefully cultivated the support of key Praetorian officers and senators, decided it was time to act decisively. The narrative often suggests she gave the order, or at least her tacit approval, for the removal of Elagabalus. She had brought him to power. She would now be instrumental in his downfall, all to preserve the dynasty and perhaps in her mind, the stability of Rome itself. On March 11th or 12th, 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard mutinied. Elagabalus, now just 18 years old, and his mother, Julia Maesa, who had been his staunchest supporter and perhaps a co-conspirator in his excesses, sought refuge in the palace. But there was no escape. The soldiers stormed their quarters. The accounts of his final moments are grim. Some say he tried to hide in a chest. He and his mother were dragged out, brutally murdered, and their bodies subjected to the ultimate Roman disgrace. As the video mentioned, they were beheaded. Their corpses were then reportedly dragged through the streets of Rome, a spectacle for the now vengeful populace. And finally, an attempt was made to throw them into the Tiber River. Elagabalus's body, according to some sources, was weighted down to ensure it would not be recovered for a proper burial. The boy priest from Emesa, who had dreamed of making his sun god the supreme deity of Rome, met his end in a storm of violence. A victim of his own excesses and the ruthless political machinations of his own family, the sun had set, not in glory, but in blood. With Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Maesa, dead, the city of Rome, and indeed the empire, breathed a collective sigh of relief, tinged with the grim satisfaction that often follows the fall of a despised ruler. The Praetorian Guard swiftly proclaimed Severus Alexander, the young Caesar, as the new emperor. He was just 13 years old, but he represented a return to Roman tradition and, crucially, he was under the firm guidance of his grandmother, Julia Maesa, and his mother, Julia Maesa's other daughter. The Senate, which had endured Elagabalus's reign with thinly veiled contempt, eagerly confirmed Alexander's accession. One of their first acts was to issue a damnatio memoria against Elagabalus, a condemnation of memory. This was a formal decree aimed at erasing a disgraced individual from history. His statues were to be pulled down, his name chiseled off public inscriptions, and his laws rescinded. The Elagabalium, the grand temple he had built for his god, was rededicated, some say to Jupiter. The sacred black stone of Elagabal was unceremoniously packed up and sent back to Emesa. Rome was to be purged of the Syrian sun god and his scandalous high priest. Severus Alexander's reign, which would last for 13 years, was in stark contrast to that of his cousin. Guided by Maesa and Maesa, and by a council of respected senators, he sought to restore traditional Roman values. He was portrayed as virtuous, moderate, and respectful of the Senate. Religious tolerance was reinstated, and the traditional Roman pantheon was honored. The excesses of Elagabalus's court were replaced by a more austere and dignified imperial presence. Julia Maesa had achieved her ultimate goal. The Severan dynasty was secure, and Rome was, for a time, stabilized. She remained a powerful influence until her death a few years into Alexander's reign. Her ambition, ruthlessness, and political acumen had shaped the destiny of two emperors and the course of the Roman Empire. But even a damnatio memoriae could not entirely erase Elagabalus. The memory of his reign, so bizarre and so offensive to Roman sensibilities, lingered. Historians like Cassius Dio, who had lived through it, and later writers like Herodian and the anonymous authors of the Historia Augusta, ensured that his story would be told, albeit through a lens of condemnation and often lurid exaggeration. Elagabalus became a byword for decadence, religious fanaticism, and sexual depravity. He was the emperor who tried to make a foreign god supreme, who married a Vestal virgin, who allegedly prostituted himself, and who appointed officials based on the most scandalous criteria. He was the crazy emperor, the ultimate example of what could happen when absolute power fell into the hands of someone too young, too foreign, and too disconnected from the traditions he was meant to uphold. The story of Elagabalus, as presented in the video and in many popular accounts, often focuses on these sensational aspects: the chained women, the poisonous snakes, the feasts of bald men. These tales, while making for a shocking narrative, are the very ones that his enemies and later scandal-mongering chroniclers emphasized. Modern historians try to look beyond the caricature. They see a complex figure, a young man deeply devoted to his native religion, thrust into a role he was ill-equipped to handle. They explore the political machinations of his family, the cultural clash between East and West, and the ways in which his story was shaped by hostile propaganda. Some see in his alleged gender nonconformity a figure who defied the rigid norms of his time, though interpreting this through a modern lens is fraught with difficulty. His reign serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of power and the importance of cultural understanding. He failed spectacularly because he tried to impose his will and his beliefs on a society that was not ready or willing to accept them. He lacked the political skill, the patience, and perhaps the desire to govern in a way that respected Roman traditions. The spoiled teenager, as the video called him, who was eventually beheaded on the orders of his own grandmother, or at least with her complicity, is a tragic figure in many ways. He was a pawn in his grandmother's games, a victim of his own upbringing, and ultimately a casualty of his inability to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman imperial politics. The tale of Elagabalus with all its shocking details, serves as a potent reminder from the ancient world that power, especially when unchecked and unmoored from wisdom and restraint, can lead to chaos and self-destruction, and that sometimes even a grandmother's love for power can outweigh her love for her own kin, especially when the fate of an empire and a dynasty hangs in the balance. And so, as the echoes of this tumultuous reign fade, we leave the ancient city of Rome, its marble columns gleaming under a more familiar sun. The story of Elagabalus, the boy priest who became emperor, is a dramatic one, full of sound and fury. Let it settle in your mind not as a nightmare, but as a fascinating, albeit cautionary, tale from a distant past. The world of emperors and ancient gods is now far away. Feel the peace of your own surroundings, the quiet of the night. Let go of the intrigues and the chaos. Your only task now is to rest, to allow your mind to become still and your body to find deep, restorative sleep. The stories of the past are there to teach us, to fascinate us, but now it is time for quiet. Breathe gently and drift into peaceful dreams. Good night. Okay, settle in. Find that perfectly comfortable spot. Let the weight of the day gently lift from your shoulders. Close your eyes, or let them rest softly. We're about to journey back in time, not to a land of fairy tales, but to a very real past, a story etched in the annals of history, a tale of empires, of thundering hooves, and of a continent holding its breath. Let the sounds around you fade, and allow my voice to be your guide as we drift back to the 13th century, to a world on the brink of a storm, unlike any it had ever seen. Tonight, we explore the story of why the seemingly unstoppable Mongol tide receded from the shores of Western Europe. Our story begins not in the castles and cathedrals of Europe, but far to the east, on the vast, wind-swept steppes of Mongolia. Here, under an endless sky, a man named Temujin, later known to the world as Genghis Khan, forged a nation from scattered, warring nomadic tribes. He was a visionary, a brilliant strategist, and a ruthless leader who, by the early 1200s, had united these fierce horsemen into a disciplined and terrifyingly effective military force. Imagine the Mongol warrior. From childhood, he was practically born in the saddle. His bow was an extension of his arm, capable of loosing arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. Their armies were not unwieldy masses of infantry, but swift, flowing rivers of cavalry. They moved with a speed and coordination that baffled their more static, heavily armored European counterparts. They were masters of feigned retreats, encirclements, and psychological warfare. Their intelligence networks were sophisticated, and their siegecraft, learned from conquered engineers, became brutally efficient. They were, in essence, the perfect storm of military innovation and relentless ambition. Before Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire had already exploded across Asia, swallowing kingdoms from northern China to Persia, reaching the edges of the Caucasus. His son and successor, Ogedei Khan, inherited this vast, burgeoning empire and the mandate to expand it further. Ogedei was a capable ruler, perhaps less of a raw warrior than his father, but a shrewd administrator and a firm believer in the Mongol destiny to rule the world. He established a capital at Karakorum, a bustling cosmopolitan city in the heart of the steppe, from where he directed the empire's many campaigns. One such campaign, perhaps the most ambitious, was the Great Westward Drive into Europe. The order was given, the Yasa, the Mongol legal code, invoked. The objective, the Great Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. Let us picture a young Mongol warrior, perhaps named Altan, no more than 18 summers old. He has grown up on tales of Genghis Khan's glory. His father rode with the great Khan. Now, it is Altan's turn. He sits astride his sturdy steppe pony, one of several he will take on the campaign, as horses were crucial to their mobility and were often switched mid-battle. His leather armor, hardened by lacquering, is light yet effective. His recurve bow, made of horn, wood, and sinew, is a masterpiece of engineering. He carries a saber, a lance, perhaps a mace. He is part of a tumen, a unit of 10,000 warriors, a cog in a perfectly oiled machine. He feels a thrill of anticipation mixed with a knot of fear. He has heard whispers of the riches of the West, of strange peoples and mighty fortresses. But above all, he feels the weight of the great Khan's command and the unshakable belief in their destiny. The vast army, a sea of horsemen, begins to move, a dark tide flowing west, leaving behind the familiar grasslands for the unknown forests and fields of Europe. The first major European territories to feel the full force of this tide were the Principalities of Rus, a collection of often feuding states that occupied what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They were a diverse people, a mix of Slavs, Vikings, and Finno-Ugric tribes, largely Orthodox Christian. They had their own proud warrior traditions, their druzhina, the prince's retinue, but they were disunited, unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the Mongol onslaught. In the winter of 1236-1237, under the overall command of Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, and the strategic genius of General Subutai, one of Genghis's most trusted and experienced commanders, the Mongols struck. Subutai was an old man by then, perhaps in his 60s, but his mind was as sharp as any saber. He had campaigned from China to the Caspian Sea and understood warfare on a continental scale like few others in history. They first crushed the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people living along the Volga River. Then, they turned their attention to the Rus' principalities. The city of Ryazan was one of the first to fall. The Mongols sent envoys demanding a tenth of everything: people, horses, wealth. The princes of Ryazan, defiant, replied, "Only when none of us remain will all be yours." It was a brave but tragic response. The Mongols besieged Ryazan for 6 days. Their engineers, likely Chinese and Persian captives, constructed siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams. The city's wooden walls, though formidable by local standards, could not withstand the relentless bombardment. When the walls were breached, the Mongols poured in. The chronicles speak of unspeakable slaughter. The city was razed, its population massacred. The tale of Evpati Kolovrat, a Ryazan boyar who, upon returning to find his city destroyed, gathered a small band and launched a suicidal counterattack against the Mongol rearguard, became a legend of desperate heroism. Though he and his men were eventually overwhelmed, their ferocity reportedly impressed even Batu Khan. From Ryazan, the Mongols advanced, a winter campaign across frozen rivers that served as highways: Suzdal, Vladimir, Moscow, then a minor town. All fell. The Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir was defeated and killed at the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238. The Mongols were systematic. They would surround a city, offer terms, and if refused, they would unleash their full fury. They used terror as a weapon, hoping that news of their brutality would cow other cities into submission. One small town, Kozelsk, offered unexpectedly fierce resistance. For 7 weeks, its citizens, knowing their fate if they surrendered, fought tooth and nail. The Mongols, infuriated by the delay and their losses, eventually overran it and, in their fury, slaughtered every living soul. They nicknamed it the Evil City because of the trouble it had caused them. Imagine a young woman, Anya, In the great city of Kiev, the mother of Rus's cities, with its golden domed cathedrals, it is the autumn of 1240. For months, terrifying rumors have been arriving with refugees from the east. Tales of an unstoppable enemy, of cities turned to ash, of rivers running red. Now, the enemy is at their gates. From the walls of Kiev, Anya sees them. A seemingly endless encampment of yurts, the smoke of countless campfires, and the dark, disciplined lines of Mongol horsemen. The air is filled with the creak of their siege engines being assembled, the strange guttural shouts of their commands, the eerie sound of their war drums. The defenders of Kiev, led by the voivode Dmitro, fight bravely, but the Mongols breach the massive earthen and wooden ramparts near the lock gate. The fighting spills into the streets, a desperate, house-to-house struggle. The magnificent Church of the Tithes, where many civilians had sought refuge, collapses under the weight of people on its roof or is set ablaze, burying them in its ruins. Dmitro, though wounded, is spared by Batu Khan, reportedly for his bravery. But Kiev, the jewel of Rus's, is plundered and largely destroyed. The papal envoy, Giovanni de Pian del Carpine, passing through several years later, would describe seeing countless skulls and bones littering the fields. By the end of 1240, most of the Rus principalities lay shattered and under Mongol dominion. The Mongol yoke, as it came to be known, would last for centuries in some regions, profoundly shaping the course of Russian history. But the Mongols were not finished. Their eyes were set further west. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol war machine, having regrouped and resupplied, launched a devastating multi-pronged invasion into Central Europe. Subutai, the master strategist, divided his forces to conquer multiple targets simultaneously and prevent any unified European response. One wing, under Baidar and Kadan, other grandsons of Genghis Khan, swept into Poland. The Polish duchies, like the Rus principalities, were fragmented and ill-prepared. The Mongols burned Sandomierz, then Krakow, a combined force of Poles, Moravians, and a contingent of Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights, under Duke Henry II, the Pious of Silesia, met the Mongols at the Battle of Legnica, also known as the Battle of Wallstadt, on April 9, 1241. Picture Sir Conrad, a Teutonic knight, clad in his heavy mail and white surcoat emblazoned with a black cross. He is a veteran of crusades in the Holy Land and Prussia. He and his fellow knights are the elite shock cavalry of Europe, confident in their charge, their faith, and their steel. As they line up on the field of Legnica, they see the Mongol army, smaller in number than their own, it seems, and strangely dressed. The European knights charge, a thunderous wave of iron and horseflesh. But the Mongols don't meet them head-on in the way they expect. They yield, then envelop. They use smoke screens, possibly from burning reeds, to confuse the Europeans. Their archers unleash blizzards of arrows, targeting the less armored horses of the knights, bringing them down, then picking off the dismounted, struggling men. The Mongols feign retreats, luring parts of the European army into traps. Sir Conrad sees his comrades falling, his duke unhorsed and killed. The disciplined formations of the Europeans break down into chaos. The battle becomes a slaughter. The Mongols, according to some accounts, collected ears from the fallen to count the dead, 9 sacks full. Duke Henry's head was paraded on a spear. The road into the heart of Germany seemed open. Simultaneously, the main Mongol force, led by Batu and Subutai themselves, struck south into Hungary. King Bela IV of Hungary was aware of the Mongol threat. He had even granted asylum to some Cuman tribes fleeing the Mongols, a decision that caused internal strife but also provided him with experienced light cavalry. However, His kingdom was also beset by internal divisions among the powerful nobles. The Mongols, with incredible speed, crossed the Carpathian Mountains through several passes in March 1241, a feat considered nearly impossible, especially for such a large army. They brushed aside Hungarian border defenses. King Bela IV managed to gather a large army, including Hungarian nobles, Croatian contingents, and some Knights Templar. He marched east to confront the invaders. The two armies met at the Mohi Heath on the banks of the Sajo River on April 11, 1241, just 2 days after the disaster at Legnica. The Hungarians had established a fortified wagon lager, a defensive circle of wagons, a tactic common in Eastern Europe. For a day, there were skirmishes. The Mongols attempted to force a crossing of the Sajo Bridge, but were repulsed. It seemed the Hungarians had a strong defensive position. But Subutai was a master of deception and maneuver. During the night, he sent a part of his army upstream to find a ford and outflank the Hungarian camp. As dawn broke, the main Mongol force launched a fierce assault on the bridge, using stone-throwing siege engines to clear the Hungarian crossbowmen. Once the bridge was taken, the Mongols poured across. Simultaneously, the flanking force appeared from the rear. The Hungarian camp was surrounded. Panic erupted. The disciplined Mongol archers rained arrows into the packed camp. The Hungarian knights, brave but outmaneuvered, fought desperately. King Bela IV himself barely managed to escape the encirclement, thanks to the sacrifice of some of his loyal followers. What followed was a massacre. The Mongols, feigning to leave an escape route, channeled the fleeing Hungarians into a swampy area where they were easily cut down. The Hungarian army was annihilated. For days, the Mongols hunted down survivors. The Kingdom of Hungary was left defenseless. Let us imagine King Bela IV, his royal pride shattered, a fugitive in his own land. He flees west, then south towards the Adriatic coast, the Mongols relentlessly pursuing him. He sends desperate pleas for help to the Pope, to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, to the King of France, but help is slow to come, if it comes at all. Western Europe is shocked, terrified, but also mired in its own political squabbles. The Pope and the Emperor are locked in a bitter power struggle. Some even whisper that Frederick II, known for his unorthodox views and contacts with the East, might be in league with the Mongols, a baseless but telling rumor of the fear and confusion of the times. Batu Khan's forces ravaged Hungary. Pest was burned. They crossed the frozen Danube in the winter of 1242 and continued their devastation in western Hungary and into Croatia, chasing King Bela IV all the way to the Dalmatian coast. Mongol scouting parties raided into Austria, reaching the outskirts of Wiener Neustadt, not far from Vienna. It seemed that nothing could stop them. The heart of Europe, Germany, France, Italy, lay exposed. The Pope called for a crusade against the Mongols. Prayers were offered in every church. Europe held its breath, expecting the final, cataclysmic blow. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the storm began to recede. In the spring of 1242, the Mongol armies, seemingly on the verge of conquering all of Central Europe, began to withdraw. They pulled back from Hungary, from Poland, from Dalmatia, marching eastwards back towards the steppes. Why? What had happened? Had the fledgling European defenses finally proven too strong? Had the forests and mountains of Central Europe proven too difficult for steppe cavalry? No. The reason lay far away, in the distant Mongol capital of Karakorum. News, carried by swift messengers across thousands of miles, had finally reached Batu Khan and Subutai in Europe. Agade Khan, the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, had died in December 1241. Imagine Batu Khan's camp, somewhere in Hungary, or perhaps already on the move eastward. A rider, exhausted, his horse lathered, arrives bearing the imperial seal. He delivers the message to Batu, perhaps in a council with Subutai and other princes. Ogedei is dead. The words hang heavy in the air. For the Mongols, the death of the great Khan was not just the loss of a leader, it was a constitutional crisis. Mongol law and custom, the Yasa, dictated that upon the death of the great Khan, all princes of the royal bloodline of Genghis Khan, especially those leading major armies or governing significant territories, had to return to Mongolia to participate in a Kurultai. This great council would elect the new great Khan. Batu Khan was a powerful prince. He was a grandson of Genghis. He had ambitions. The succession was likely to be contested. His presence, and the presence of the formidable army he commanded, would be crucial in the political maneuvering that would inevitably follow. Staying in Europe, no matter how tempting the prospect of further conquest, meant risking being sidelined in the power struggles back home, potentially losing influence, or even facing a hostile new great Khan. The heart of the empire was where power was decided. Subutai, the old general, would have understood this. His loyalty was to the Mongol Empire as a whole, and its stability depended on a smooth, or at least decisive, succession. The European campaign, however successful, was secondary to the integrity of the empire itself. So, the decision was made. The armies turned around. They left behind a Europe that was stunned, relieved, and utterly bewildered. They couldn't know the internal Mongol politics that had saved them. To many, it seemed like a miracle, a divine intervention. The withdrawal was not a panicked retreat. It was an orderly, if still destructive, march eastward. They took their plunder and their captives with them. Europe had been given a reprieve, bought not by its own strength, but by the death of a distant emperor. What happened next? Batu Khan returned to the western part of the Mongol Empire. He did not, in the end, become the great Khan. Gyuk Khan, Ogedei's son, was eventually elected in 1246 after a lengthy interregnum, partly due to Batu's own delaying tactics and rivalry with Gyuk. Batu consolidated his own power base in the lands of the former Kipchak Khanate and the conquered Rus's principalities, establishing what became known as the Golden Horde. This Khanate would dominate Eastern Europe for over 2 centuries, collecting tribute from the Rus's princes, launching raids, and profoundly influencing the development of Russia. The Mongols never returned to Central and Western Europe with the same focused, overwhelming force. There were later raids, particularly into Poland and Hungary, but not a full-scale invasion aimed at total conquest. Why? Several reasons. The internal politics of the Mongol Empire became increasingly complex and fractious. After Guyuk's short reign, and then the reign of Mongke Khan, another grandson of Genghis, favored by Batu, the empire began to show signs of fragmentation. Civil wars erupted. The vast distances made centralized control difficult. The different parts of the empire, the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, Monkey's brother, began to pursue their own interests. Western Europe, for its part, learned some lessons. They began to understand more about Mongol tactics. Fortifications were improved. But arguably, the main factor was the shift in Mongol priorities and the sheer logistical challenge of maintaining huge armies so far from their heartland, especially in terrain less suited to their traditional cavalry tactics than the open steppes. The forests, mountains, and numerous fortified towns of Western Europe would have presented a more sustained, grinding challenge than the initial campaigns. One can only speculate what might have happened if Ogedei Khan had lived another 5 or 10 years. Would Subutai and Batu have pushed on into Germany, France, Italy? It's a chilling what-if of history. Given their track record, it's hard to bet against them having achieved further devastating successes. The course of European civilization might have been very different. Imagine a scholar, Brother Thomas, in a monastery in France, perhaps a decade after the Mongol withdrawal. He pores over letters and chronicles, trying to understand the Tatars, as they were often called. He had heard the terrifying accounts from refugees, the papal envoys who had journeyed east. He remembers the panic, the calls for a crusade that never fully materialized in a unified way. He thanks God for the miraculous deliverance, but a shiver still runs down his spine when he thinks of how close the storm had come. He writes of them as a scourge of God, a divine punishment, but also marvels at their military discipline and the vastness of their empire. The Mongols remained a distant, terrifying enigma, a shadow on the eastern horizon. And so, the great Mongol tide, which had surged so powerfully across Asia and into the heart of Europe, lapped at the shores of the Adriatic and the gates of Vienna. Then, due to events thousands of miles away, began its slow, inexorable retreat from the westernmost lands. Europe, bruised and terrified, was spared. The reasons were complex, rooted in the unique political structure of the Mongol Empire, a structure that, in this instance, inadvertently saved a continent. And as the echoes of those thundering hooves fade into the mists of time, and the story of Batu Khan and Ogedei's passing settles in your mind, feel yourself returning to the quiet of your room. The great dramas of history, the rise and fall of empires, the fates of millions decided by distant events, they are a reminder of the intricate tapestry of our shared past. But for now, that past can rest. Let the knowledge that Europe was spared, that the storm passed, bring a sense of peace. Let go of any lingering thoughts of battles and conquests. Focus on your breath, the gentle rise and fall, a rhythm as old as time itself. May your dreams be peaceful and your rest deep and restorative. Good night. Settle in, dear listener. Let the day's worries drift away like leaves on a gentle stream. Breathe deeply. Imagine the soft glow of an oil lamp, casting flickering shadows on ancient walls, its scent of olive oil mingling with the cool night air. We are about to journey to a world vastly different from our own, yet one whose echoes still resonate with profound power today. It is the story of the Roman Empire, a civilization of unparalleled might, intricate laws, and breathtaking artistry, and its extraordinary, almost unimaginable transformation from a bastion of ancient pagan gods to the heartland of a new and burgeoning faith, Christianity. This is a tale of emperors and slaves, of martyrs and visionaries, of clashing armies and whispered prayers, a story that reshaped the very soul of Western civilization. For centuries, the Roman world had been a vibrant tapestry woven with the threads of countless deities. At the apex stood Jupiter Optimus Maximus, best and greatest, whose magnificent temple on the Capitoline Hill was the symbolic heart of Rome, the place where triumphant generals offered their spoils. Mars Gradivus, the striding god of war, was invoked before every legion marched into battle. His blessing sought for victory and the expansion of Roman dominion. Juno, queen of the gods and protector of women and marriage. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, from whom the Julian family claimed descent. Minerva, patroness of wisdom, crafts, and strategic warfare. Neptune, ruler of the seas, vital for an empire that spanned the Mediterranean. These and a host of other major and minor deities governed every conceivable aspect of Roman life. From the grand affairs of state, where augurs meticulously read the entrails of sacrificed animals or the flight of birds to discern divine will, to the intimate rituals of the household, where the lares and penates, ancestral spirits, protected the family hearth, Roman existence was inextricably linked to this divine order. Their statues, crafted from gleaming marble and bronze, adorned public forums, bathhouses, and private villas. Their temples, architectural marvels of columns and pediments, dominated cityscapes from Britannia to Syria. Elaborate festivals, such as the Saturnalia with its joyful inversions of social order, or the Lupercalia with its ancient fertility rites, punctuated the Roman calendar, binding communities together in shared worship and celebration. To be Roman was, in a profound sense, to honor these ancient protectors, to participate in the age-old sacrifices and ceremonies that were believed to ensure the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. This divine favor was seen as the very foundation of Rome's success, its enduring strength, and its ability to rule a vast and diverse empire. But beneath the seemingly immutable surface of this deeply ingrained religious landscape, new, almost imperceptible currents were stirring, like an underground river seeking the sea. From the sun-baked rocky hills of Judea, a province often restive under Roman rule, a message had begun to spread, a message that was both radical and deeply personal. It spoke of a single, all-powerful, invisible God, the creator of all things. It told of his son, Jesus of Nazareth, a charismatic teacher and miracle worker who had been crucified by Roman authorities, but, his followers passionately proclaimed, had risen from the dead, conquering death itself. This Jesus, they taught, was the Christ, the Messiah, and through faith in him, humanity could find forgiveness for sin, reconciliation with God, and the promise of eternal life. Initially dismissed by Roman officials and intellectuals as a curious, perhaps troublesome, offshoot of Judaism, another of the many Eastern superstitions that found their way to the cosmopolitan heart of the empire, Christianity slowly, persistently, began to take root. Its journey was quiet at first, spreading along the trade routes, carried by merchants, soldiers, and itinerant preachers. Its appeal was remarkably diverse, transcending social class, ethnicity, and gender. To the slave, crushed by a brutal system, it offered inherent dignity as a child of God and the hope of ultimate liberation. To the philosopher, weary of the endless debates of competing schools, it presented a coherent and compelling new understanding of the cosmos and human purpose. To the grieving, it offered profound solace and the promise of a future reunion with loved ones. To women, often marginalized in Roman society, it offered significant roles within its communities and a sense of spiritual equality. The early Christian communities, or ecclesiae assemblies, often met in secret, or at least discreetly, in private homes, domus ecclesiae, or, during times of intense danger, in the shadowy, labyrinthine confines of the catacombs, vast underground burial networks outside the city walls. Their worship was strikingly different from the public, civic spectacles of pagan ritual. It centered on readings from their sacred scriptures, the Hebrew Bible and the rapidly forming collection of Gospels and apostolic letters, communal prayers, the singing of hymns, and the sharing of a sacred meal, the Eucharist or Holy Communion, which commemorated Christ's Last Supper and sacrifice. They spoke of a kingdom not of this world, and their resolute monotheism, their insistence on the exclusive worship of their one God, often brought them into direct and dangerous conflict with Roman authorities. A key point of friction was their refusal to participate in the imperial cult, the state-sponsored worship of the living and deceased emperors as divine figures. To Romans, this was not merely a religious act, but a fundamental expression of loyalty and civic duty. To refuse was seen as treasonous, an affront to the majesty of the emperor, and a threat to the well-being of the state. Consequently, persecutions flared, sometimes localized and sporadic, driven by mob violence or the zeal of a particular provincial governor, at other times more organized and empire-wide, initiated by imperial edict. Emperors like Nero in the Unnist century, who infamously blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, or Domitian, or later Decius and Valerian in the 3rd century, launched campaigns of varying intensity to suppress the faith. The names of martyrs, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Perpetua, and Felicity, became legends. Their courageous endurance in the face of horrific deaths, crucifixion, burning, being thrown to wild beasts in the arena, serving not to extinguish the faith, but to inspire yet more to join its ranks. As the 1st century Christian apologist Tertullian famously wrote, "The blood of Christians is seed." The great persecution, initiated under Emperor Diocletian and his co-rulers starting in 303 AD, was perhaps the most severe and systematic attempt to eradicate Christianity once and for all. Imperial edicts ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of sacred scriptures, the arrest of clergy, and compelled all citizens to offer public sacrifice to the pagan gods on pain of imprisonment, torture, or death. For nearly a decade in some parts of the empire, Christians endured a relentless onslaught. Yet, like a resilient reed in a storm, Christianity bent but did not break. In fact, the persecutions often had the unintended effect of strengthening the faith, purifying its resolve by weeding out the faint-hearted and drawing admiration even from some pagans for its adherents' unwavering conviction and their compassionate care for one another, even for their persecutors. It is into this world of profound religious tension, of imperial grandeur and spiritual searching, of brutal persecution and tenacious faith, that our central figure, Constantine, is born. Flavius Valerius Constantinus, the man who would become known to history as Constantine the Great, entered the world around 272 AD in Naissus, a bustling military city in the Roman province of Moesia Superior, modern-day Niš, Serbia. His father, Flavius Constantius, later known as Constantius Chlorus, the Pale, was a skilled military officer of Illyrian stock, a man of ambition and rising prominence in the Roman army. His mother, Helena, was a woman of humble origins, possibly an innkeeper's daughter from Bithynia in Asia Minor, though later Christian tradition would elevate her to sainthood and credit her with discovering the true cross. In these early years, her social standing was modest. Constantius would eventually divorce Helena for political reasons to marry Theodora, the stepdaughter of Emperor Maximian, further cementing his position within the imperial elite. The Roman Empire at the time of Constantine's youth was a sprawling, almost unmanageable entity, stretching from the misty frontiers of Britannia to the deserts of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Decades of civil war, barbarian incursions, and economic instability had taken their toll. To bring order and more effective governance, Emperor Diocletian, a brilliant administrator and military reformer, had instituted the Tetrarchy in 293 AD, a system of rule by 4. There would be 2 senior emperors, titled Augusti, Diocletian in the east, and Maximian in the west, and 2 junior emperors, or Caesars, who were their designated successors, Galerius under Diocletian, and Constantius, Constantine's father, under Maximian. Each ruler was assigned a portion of the empire to govern and defend, though Diocletian remained the ultimate authority. Constantius Chlorus, as Caesar, was responsible for the western provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania. Young Constantine, however, did not spend these formative years under his father's direct tutelage. Instead, He was raised in the East, at the imperial courts of Diocletian in Nicomedia, and later Galerius in Thessalonica. This was partly to receive a first-class education in Latin and Greek, military strategy, and statecraft, but it also served as a form of gentile hostage-taking, a common Roman practice to ensure the loyalty of powerful generals stationed far from the imperial center. Here, Constantine witnessed firsthand the opulent splendor and the ruthless machinations of imperial power. Crucially, he was also a direct observer of the Great Persecution, which was prosecuted with particular ferocity in the eastern provinces under Diocletian and Galerius. He saw churches razed, scriptures burned, and Christians arrested, tortured, and executed. What he thought of these brutal measures at the time, we can only surmise. He was, after all, a young officer in a pagan emperor's court, but the scenes of suffering and the quiet dignity of the persecuted Christians undoubtedly left a deep and lasting impression upon his developing mind. The Tetrarchy, Diocletian's carefully constructed system designed for stability and orderly succession, soon began to unravel after Diocletian and his co-Augustus Maximian took the unprecedented step of voluntarily abdicating in 305 AD. A complex and bloody series of civil wars erupted as various claimants, driven by ambition and backed by their loyal legions, vied for supreme power. The designated Caesars, Constantius and Galerius, were elevated to Augusti, but the appointment of new Caesars proved contentious. Constantine, who had managed to leave Galerius's court, some say he fled by night, hamstringing the post horses behind him to prevent pursuit, joined his ailing father Constantius in Gaul, and accompanied him on a campaign in Britannia against the Picts. When Constantius died in Eboracum, modern-day York, in July 306 AD, his loyal troops, bypassing the established tetrarchic protocols, immediately proclaimed his charismatic son, Constantine, as Augustus. This was a direct challenge to the authority of Galerius, now the senior Augustus, and it set Constantine on a collision course with other powerful men who believed they had a greater claim to rule the Roman world. One of his chief rivals in the West was Maxentius, the son of the former Emperor Maximian. Bitter at being overlooked in the power-sharing arrangements after his father's abdication, Maxentius had seized control of Rome and Italy in a popular uprising, styling himself as the true protector of the ancient city and its sacred traditions. For several years, Constantine consolidated his power base in Gaul and Britain, proving himself an able administrator and a successful military commander, securing the Rhine frontier against Germanic tribes. He bided his time, building his forces, forging strategic alliances, including a marriage to Fausta, Maxentius's sister and Maximian's daughter, and watching the intricate, deadly dance of alliances and betrayals among the other contending emperors. By 312 AD, the political situation had simplified somewhat, but the stakes were higher than ever. Constantine, now controlling a significant portion of the Western Empire, made a daring and audacious decision. He would march on Rome itself and challenge Maxentius for sole control of the West. It was an enormous gamble. Maxentius had a larger army, the formidable Aurelian walls of Rome for defense, and the vast resources of Italy at his disposal. Constantine's forces were smaller, though highly disciplined, and fiercely loyal to their young general. He was leading his men deep into his enemy's territory, far from his own supply lines. Failure would mean not just defeat, but utter annihilation, the fate of the Western Roman Empire, and unknowingly, the future trajectory of a global religion hung precariously in the balance. Imagine the scene, dear listener, as the crisp autumn air of northern Italy gives way to the warmer climes further south. The rhythmic tramp of thousands of legionaries' hobnailed sandals on the ancient Roman roads, the Via Flaminia, perhaps, echoes through the countryside. The glint of the autumn sun on polished helmets, segmented armor, and the legionary standards, the aquilae, eagles, held aloft, symbols of Roman might. Constantine, a charismatic figure in his early 30s, rode at the head of his men, a mixture of seasoned veterans from his father's campaigns and new Gallic recruits. He was known for sharing his soldiers' hardships, for his personal bravery, and for an almost preternatural ability to inspire loyalty. But even his iron will must have felt the immense pressure of the undertaking. As Constantine's army advanced southwards, pushing Maxentius's forces back in a series of preliminary engagements, they drew ever closer to Rome. They eventually camped near Saxa Rubra, Red Rocks, about 9 miles north of the city, not far from the Milvian Bridge, a crucial stone crossing point over the Tiber River. It was here, on the eve of what would be the decisive battle, that an event occurred that would forever be enshrined in Christian legend and Western history. The accounts, primarily from the Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who, in his life of Constantine, claimed to have heard the story from the emperor himself years later, and the Christian rhetorician Lactantius, who wrote his On the Deaths of the Persecutors much closer to the event, differ in some details but converge on the core of a profound transformative experience. Lactantius, writing first, describes Constantine being warned in a dream on the night before the battle to have the heavenly sign of God delineated on the shields of his soldiers. Eusebius provides a more dramatic account. He states that on the afternoon of October 27th, 312 AD, as Constantine was marching with his army, he looked up towards the sun and saw, superimposed upon it, a luminous cross of light. Above it, or perhaps intertwined with it, were Greek letters. Some accounts say simply Chi, Che, Rho, the first 2 letters of Christos, Christ, in Greek, forming a monogram. Others suggest the inscription Rou nu tau mikron, tau o ni kappa alpha, and tutoi nika, in Greek, or its Latin equivalent, in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, you shall conquer. Eusebius further recounts that Constantine was puzzled by this vision and pondered its meaning. That night, Christ himself appeared to him in a dream, holding the same sign he had seen in the heavens, and commanded him to make a likeness of it and use it as a protective standard in all engagements with his enemies. Shaken but resolute, Constantine awoke with a newfound, almost electrifying conviction. He summoned his artisans and described the vision to them. They were ordered to create a new, magnificent standard, the labarum. This consisted of a long spear with a transverse bar, from which hung a rich banner of purple silk, heavily embroidered in gold with the sacred Chi-Rho monogram. More immediately, and perhaps more crucially for the coming battle, he commanded his soldiers to paint this sacred symbol, the Chi-Rho, on their shields. Picture the scene in the Roman camp that morning. Hardened legionaries, men from Gaul, Britain, and Germany, many of whom had likely offered sacrifices to traditional Roman or Celtic war gods like Mars, Teutates, or the soldier god Mithras just days or weeks before, now carefully daubing this strange new emblem onto their battle gear. Some might have been bewildered, perhaps muttering amongst themselves about the general sudden interest in this obscure Jewish sect. Others, particularly if there were already Christians within the ranks, and there likely were despite persecutions, might have felt a surge of hope and divine assurance. For many, it was simply an order from a commander they trusted implicitly, a leader who had consistently led them to victory. But for Constantine himself, this was clearly a profound personal and spiritual turning point. He was, in a very public and irreversible way, placing his faith and the fate of his army and his imperial ambitions in the hands of the Christian God. He was, in effect, making a pact. The following day, October 28th, 312 AD, the armies of Constantine and Maxentius clashed in the decisive Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Maxentius, despite having a numerically superior force and the advantage of Rome's formidable Aurelian walls behind him, had been lured out of the city. Perhaps he was overconfident in his numbers, or perhaps, as some ancient sources suggest, he had consulted pagan oracles which gave ambiguous prophecies that he misinterpreted in his favor. One reportedly said, the enemy of the Romans would perish, which Maxentius assumed meant Constantine. He had drawn up his forces with the Tiber River at their back, a tactically precarious position, to ensure an escape route if needed, or perhaps to allow for a feigned retreat to draw Constantine in. Maxentius had also constructed a temporary bridge of boats alongside the stone Milvian Bridge. The battle was fierce and bloody. Constantine's troops, fighting with a desperate valor, perhaps emboldened by their new insignia and their leader's unwavering divine assurance, launched a powerful cavalry charge that began to break Maxentius's lines. The infantry engagement was hard fought, but Constantine's smaller, more mobile, and battle-hardened army gradually gained the upper hand. As Maxentius's troops began to falter and then break, they were pushed back towards the Tiber. The narrow stone Milvian Bridge became a deadly bottleneck. In the ensuing chaos and panic of the retreat, the makeshift bridge of boats, overburdened by the crush of fleeing soldiers and their heavy equipment, collapsed. Thousands were plunged into the swirling, muddy waters of the Tiber. Maxentius himself, attempting to flee back into the city, was caught in the rout, thrown from his horse into the river, and, weighed down by his heavy armor, drowned. His Praetorian Guard, elite soldiers fiercely loyal to him, fought to the death on the northern bank, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Constantine had won a stunning and complete victory. The following day, Maxentius's body was recovered from the Tiber. His head was severed and paraded through the streets of Rome on a spear, a grim and customary testament to Constantine's absolute triumph and the demise of his rival. Constantine then made his formal entry into Rome, not just as a military conqueror, but as a man widely perceived to have been touched by a divine mandate. The Roman Senate, ever pragmatic in the face of overwhelming power, hailed him as the senior Augustus and savior of the city. Statues were decreed in his honor, including a colossal one, parts of which survive today, depicting him holding the labarum. But something had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. The victory at the Milvian Bridge, achieved so decisively under the sign of the cross, was not just a political or military triumph. It was increasingly seen by Constantine, and by a growing number of others, as a clear and unambiguous vindication of the Christian God's superior power. The immediate aftermath of this victory was not a forced conversion of the empire or the immediate outlawing of paganism. Constantine was a shrewd and pragmatic politician, as well as a man of burgeoning and perhaps complex personal faith. He understood the deeply ingrained nature of pagan traditions, especially among the Roman elite. His initial steps were characterized by a policy of toleration and reconciliation. In February 313 AD, just a few months after his victory, Constantine traveled to Milan in northern Italy to meet with Licinius, who had by then become the Augustus in the east after defeating other rivals. Together, these two emperors issued a joint proclamation that has become famously known as the Edict of Milan. This landmark decree did not, as is sometimes mistakenly believed, make Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. That would come much later. Rather, the Edict of Milan proclaimed universal religious toleration. It granted Christians, and indeed all people within the empire, the full freedom to worship whichever deity they chose, so that whatever divinity is enthroned in heaven may be gracious and favorable to us and to all who are under our rule. This was a revolutionary concept in a world where religion and state were typically intertwined, and where rulers often demanded religious conformity. Crucially for Christians, the edict specifically ordered the end of all persecution and the restoration of all confiscated Christian property, including churches, cemeteries, and other communal assets, without delay or expense to the Christian communities. This was a momentous act of justice and restitution. Let us imagine ourselves once more, not just in the bustling Roman Forum, but in various corners of the vast empire. A few months after the Edict of Milan was proclaimed and its contents began to circulate through official channels and by word of mouth, the news, carried by imperial couriers, merchants, and traveling Christians, would have elicited a wide spectrum of reactions. In the Roman Forum, the old senator, Lucius Verus, clad in his traditional, carefully draped toga, shakes his head as he discusses the matter with a fellow patrician near the ancient Temple of Saturn, its weathered columns a testament to centuries of Roman piety. Toleration? For these Christians? He mutters, his brow furrowed with a mixture of disdain and apprehension. They deny our ancestral gods, the very gods who nurtured Rome from a humble village to the mistress of the world. What will become of the Pax Deorum, the sacred peace between gods and men, if we allow such impiety, such atheism as some call it, to flourish openly? Constantine is young, victorious, yes, but perhaps too influenced by this Eastern superstition he seems to have embraced. This is a dangerous path, my friend, a path that could unravel the very fabric of Roman tradition. His companion, more pragmatic, might suggest that as long as the public order is maintained and the grain supply is secure, perhaps it matters little which gods the common folk worship in private. Not far away, perhaps in the Transtiberum district where many poorer folk and immigrants lived, near a newly reopened Christian meeting house, a simple building, perhaps once a warehouse, or a private home now openly dedicated to worship, a young woman named Lyra clutches a small, crudely carved wooden cross hidden beneath her tunic. Her eyes, which have known too much fear, now shine with unshed tears of joy as she speaks to an elder of her community, a presbyteros named Clement. Did you hear, Father Clement? The full text of the edict has arrived. We can worship freely. No more hiding in the catacombs. No more fear of the vigils, city watch, knock at the door in the dead of night. My brother, Marcus, he was taken in the last persecution, under Galerius. He refused to burn incense to the emperor's genius. If only he could have lived to see this day. Clement, his face etched with the deep lines of past hardships and quiet suffering, nods slowly, his gaze distant for a moment as he remembers fallen friends. The Lord works in mysterious and wonderful ways, child. This Emperor Constantine, he carries the sign of the Christ upon his standards. Perhaps this is the dawn for which generations have prayed. But we must be wise and vigilant. The old ways have deep roots in this city, in the hearts of many. Freedom is a precious, fragile gift. It must be nurtured with prayer, with humility, and with steadfast faith, showing love even to those who do not yet understand. Meanwhile, in a bustling port city like Alexandria in Egypt, a Greek merchant named Demetrios, who has a small Christian cell meeting in his home, discusses the news with a Jewish scholar in the marketplace. It seems the winds are changing, my friend, Demetrios says, a hopeful gleam in his eye. This edict from Milan, it speaks of freedom for all, including us Christians. Perhaps now we can build a proper church, not just meet in homes. The Jewish scholar, whose own community had long experienced varying degrees of toleration and persecution, might nod thoughtfully. Freedom of worship is a blessing. May it last. But imperial favor can be as fickle as the Alexandrian winds. And far away, in a small town in Gaul, a Roman legionary, returning home on leave, might tell his pagan family about the strange symbols on their shields before the great battle near Rome, and how their general, Constantine, seemed to believe this new god had given them victory. His parents might exchange worried glances, wondering what this portended for the local temple where they had always worshipped. These whispers, these varied reactions of joy and relief, of confusion and apprehension, of cautious optimism and cynical pragmatism, would have filled the air across the diverse provinces of the Roman Empire. For Christians, the Edict of Milan was nothing short of a miracle, an answer to generations of fervent prayer, the end of a long and bloody nightmare. For staunch pagans, it was a deeply worrying concession, a potential erosion of Roman identity, and a slight to the gods who had, in their view, always protected Rome. For many ordinary people, preoccupied with the daily struggles of life, it was perhaps just another imperial decree in a long line of them, its true, world-altering significance yet to unfold. Constantine's personal commitment to Christianity, though perhaps evolving and not always conforming to later Orthodox standards, deepened visibly over the years following the Edict of Milan. While he strategically maintained the traditional imperial title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state's pagan cult, a political necessity to avoid alienating the still powerful pagan aristocracy and populace, his actions and policies increasingly favored his adopted faith. He lavished imperial funds on the construction of magnificent Christian churches throughout the empire. Notable among these were the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, built over the traditional site of St. Peter's tomb on Vatican Hill, the Basilica of St. John Lateran, which became Rome's cathedral, and, perhaps most famously, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This grand edifice was constructed on the purported site of Christ's crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, a project heavily influenced and overseen by his devout mother, Helena, who undertook a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in her later years and was credited by tradition with discovering the true cross and other relics. Constantine surrounded himself with Christian advisors and bishops, such as Hosius of Corduba, who became a close confidant. He elevated Christians to high positions in the imperial administration and the army, a stark reversal of previous policies. He enacted laws that reflected Christian moral values, such as prohibiting the practice of exposing unwanted infants, though its enforcement was difficult, discouraging adultery, and making Sunday, the Christian day of worship, which he referred to as the Venerable Day of the Sun, a term that could appeal to both Christians and sun worshippers, a legal day of rest for those in cities, and a day when markets were closed and public works suspended. He also abolished crucifixion as a form of capital punishment, likely out of reverence for Christ's death. One of his most significant and far-reaching acts in shaping the future of Christianity was his convening of the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The Christian Church, now free from external persecution, found itself facing serious internal divisions, particularly the Arian controversy. Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria, taught that Christ, the Son, was a created being, subordinate to God the Father, and not co-eternal or of the same divine substance. This doctrine, which challenged the full divinity of Christ, caused a major theological rift that threatened to tear the church apart. Constantine, deeply concerned that such disputes could undermine the unity of the church, which he increasingly saw as a vital spiritual support for the unity and stability of the empire, summoned bishops from across the Roman world, and even a few from beyond its borders, to Nicaea in Bithynia, modern-day Iznik, Turkey. Over 300 bishops attended. Constantine himself, though not yet baptized, presided over the opening of the council, delivering a speech in Latin urging them to find common ground and restore harmony. He participated in some of the debates, not as a theologian, but as an emperor keen on unity. The council ultimately condemned Arianism as heresy and formulated the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that affirmed the full divinity of Christ, declaring him to be true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial homoousios with the Father. This creed became a cornerstone of Christian orthodoxy for centuries to come, and the council itself set a precedent for future ecumenical councils to define Christian doctrine. It was a remarkable moment in history. The Roman emperor, whose predecessors had sought to eradicate Christianity, now acting as a convener, facilitator, and enforcer of Christian doctrinal unity. Constantine also made a monumental decision that would reshape the geopolitical and cultural landscape of the Roman Empire, the founding of a new imperial capital. He chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosphorus Strait, the waterway separating Europe and Asia. It possessed a superb natural harbor and was ideally positioned to control trade routes and defend the vulnerable eastern frontiers. He vastly expanded and rebuilt the city on a monumental scale, adorning it with magnificent forums, palaces, hippodromes, and, crucially, numerous large churches. Consecrated in 330 AD, it was officially named Nova Roma, New Rome, but it soon became popularly known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Unlike Old Rome, which was steeped in centuries of pagan traditions and dominated by ancient temples, Constantinople was conceived from the outset as a predominantly Christian capital. It was to be a center of Christian faith, learning, and imperial power in the increasingly important eastern half of the empire. Constantine's own baptism is a subject of some historical discussion. According to Eusebius of Caesarea, his biographer, Constantine, delayed his formal baptism until he was on his deathbed in Nicomedia in 337 AD. This was a relatively common practice at the time, as it was believed that baptism washed away all previous sins, and some preferred to wait until the end of life to ensure a clean slate before entering eternity, especially those whose professions, like that of an emperor, involved acts of violence or morally ambiguous decisions. He was reportedly baptized by Eusebius of Nicomedia, a bishop who held Arian-leaning sympathies, which highlights the ongoing complexities of the theological landscape. Regardless of the precise timing or the theological leanings of the baptizing bishop, Constantine's profound and public embrace of Christianity throughout the latter part of his reign was undeniable and transformative. Let us imagine an elderly Christian priest named Matthias, perhaps in the now thriving, predominantly Christian city of Constantinople, or in a long-established Christian community in a major city like Alexandria or Antioch, sometime in the 360s or 370s AD, decades after Constantine's death. He sits by a window in a modest dwelling attached to a large, bustling basilica, its mosaics gleaming in the afternoon sun. The sounds of the Christian city, the chanting of psalms from a nearby monastery, the calls of vendors selling religious icons, the chatter of pilgrims, drift in. He holds a worn, leather-bound codex of the Gospels, its parchment pages softened by countless readings. A young acolyte, perhaps a recent convert from a rural pagan family, sits at his feet, eager to learn. "I remember the days, my son," Matthias might begin, his voice raspy with age but clear with the conviction of lived experience, "when the very name of Christ was a perilous whisper. We met in fear, in the dead of night, in the damp chill of the catacombs among the tombs of our blessed martyrs, or in the back rooms of sympathetic households, always with a lookout posted. The sacred scriptures were hidden, copied by hand in secret, at great risk. The scent of incense was not the perfume of public worship, but a dangerous giveaway. I saw friends, good men and women, dragged away by soldiers, their homes ransacked, their property confiscated. I saw churches, humble buildings though they were then, torn down stone by stone. We whispered our prayers, shared the sacred bread in haste, always listening for the tramp of soldiers' feet, the dreaded knock that could mean arrest, torture, the arena, or the mines. He gestures with a trembling hand towards the magnificent basilica nearby, its dome soaring towards the heavens, adorned with a golden cross that catches the light. And now look, basilicas, grander than any pagan temple I ever saw in my youth, rise to the glory of God in every major city, their doors open to all. The liturgy is celebrated openly, with splendid vestments and soaring hymns. The emperor himself, Constantine of blessed and eternal memory, bore the Holy Cross on his standards and sat among our bishops at Nicaea. His devout mother, the Augusta Helena, journeyed to the Holy Land, and by God's grace, uncovered the true cross upon which our Savior died, or so the pilgrims returning from Jerusalem joyfully proclaim. A shadow of old sorrow, mixed with a certain sternness, might cross his weathered face. Some of the young ones today, those born into this new era of peace and imperial favor, they do not, perhaps cannot, truly understand. They have known only the church triumphant, the church respected, the church endowed with wealth and influence. They do not remember the taste of fear, the fire of persecution that tested our faith, the profound strength and fellowship that came from huddling together in the darkness, sustained only by the words of the Lord and the inspiring stories of the martyrs who went before us, singing hymns even as the flames licked at their feet. He offers a faint, bittersweet smile. But this too is God's inscrutable will. The tiny mustard seed, sown in the blood-soaked soil of persecution, has grown into a great tree, and the birds of the air, even the imperial eagles, now find shelter in its branches. The empire that once sought to crush us now proclaims his name from Britannia to the Persian frontier. It is a miracle, young one, a divine intervention in the affairs of men that I, in my darkest days, never thought I would live to see. We must pray fervently, that this newfound strength, this worldly power, is used wisely, that the church remains true to the humble teachings of the Master of Fishermen, even in its newfound power and earthly splendor. For power, my son, can be as great a test of faith as persecution. The complete transformation of the Roman Empire into a Christian state was not an instantaneous event that occurred solely during Constantine's reign. Paganism, with its centuries of tradition, its rich mythology, its deeply ingrained festivals, and its powerful vested interests, especially among the old senatorial aristocracy in Rome and in many rural areas where traditions died hard, remained a significant force for a long time. There were periods of pagan reaction and revival, most notably under Constantine's own nephew, Emperor Julian, reigned 361-363 AD. Julian, later dubbed the Apostate by Christian writers, was a highly intelligent and philosophically inclined ruler who had been raised Christian but secretly embraced a form of Neoplatonic paganism. He attempted to revive pagan worship, restore temples, and disadvantage Christianity through various means, though he generally avoided outright bloody persecution. His reign, however, was short-lived. He died in battle against the Persians, and his efforts ultimately failed to reverse the tide. Nevertheless, Constantine's reign was the undeniable, pivotal turning point. He had legitimized Christianity, ended its persecution, showered it with imperial patronage, and begun the complex process of weaving it into the very fabric of Roman law, society, and imperial identity. His sons and successors, with the exception of Julian, largely continued and expanded his pro-Christian policies. Emperors like Gratian in the late 4th century began to more actively dismantle pagan institutions. For instance, by removing the altar of victory from the Senate House in Rome, a potent symbol of Roman pagan tradition, and confiscating the revenues of pagan temples and priesthoods. The process reached a legal culmination later in the 4th century under Emperor Theodosius I, reigned 379–395 AD. Through a series of increasingly stringent edicts, most notably the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, issued jointly with his co-emperors Gratian and Valentinian II, Theodosius made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This edict not only affirmed the Nicene Creed as the sole legitimate imperial faith, but also condemned other Christian creeds, like Arianism, as heretical. Subsequent laws under Theodosius went further, banning pagan sacrifices, ordering the closure of pagan temples, or their conversion into churches, and prohibiting all forms of public and even private pagan worship. The Olympic Games, with their ancient pagan associations, were held for the last time in 393 AD. The empire that had once thrown Christians to the lions now actively suppressed the traditional pagan practices that had defined it for over a millennium. The legacy of Constantine the Great is therefore immense, multifaceted, and endlessly debated by historians. He is revered as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Eastern Catholic churches, often bearing the title equal to the apostles for his role in the Christianization of the empire. In the Western Church, while not typically venerated as a saint, his historical significance as the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity is undisputed. His actions fundamentally altered the trajectory of European history and the institutional development of the Christian faith. By aligning the Church with the immense power, prestige, and administrative machinery of the Roman state, he provided it with an institutional framework, legal protection, and material resources that allowed it to flourish, expand its missionary efforts, and solidify its doctrinal structures. The fusion of Roman administrative traditions and legal concepts with Christian theology and ethics would profoundly shape the culture, laws, and institutions of the medieval world and, by extension, modern Western civilization. Of course, this close alliance between church and state, often referred to as the Constantinian shift, also brought new challenges, complexities, and temptations for the church. With imperial favor came wealth, political influence, and the potential for corruption and coercion. The church, once a persecuted minority, now found itself in a position of power, sometimes wielding that power in ways that mirrored its former persecutors. The lines between spiritual authority and temporal power became increasingly blurred. But those intricate developments, those new struggles and triumphs, are stories for another night, for another quiet moment of reflection. For now, as the oil lamp flickers low and the quiet of the deepest night envelops us, let us reflect on this extraordinary chapter of human history. It is a story of faith and empire, of brutal persecution and unexpected triumph, of a vision by a bridge that, in many ways, changed the world. The Roman Empire, a civilization built on military conquest, pragmatic law, and a pantheon of ancient pagan gods, found itself transformed from within by a message of peace, love, and a single, transcendent God, carried by a Galilean carpenter. The journey was long, arduous, complex, and often fraught with human failing and violent conflict, but its outcome reshaped the spiritual, cultural, and political map of the world in ways that still resonate with us today. Sleep now, dear listener. Let these ancient echoes, these tales of profound change and enduring faith, lull you into a peaceful and restorative slumber. May your dreams be filled with the quiet wisdom of history, and may you awaken refreshed, carrying a little of this extraordinary story with you into the new day. Good night.